And in this panel, we will discuss key trends regarding strategies displaced people are using to regain their footing, including local networking and mobility, based on our research with IDPs in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Congolese and Burundian refugees in Tanzania, with the work of organization there, with Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia, Syrian refugees in Jordan, and Afghan refugees in Pakistan. We'll shed light on what it means to live in protracted displacement, people do themselves to escape from this, and the structural, institutional, and societal hurdles they face in doing so. And we will also look into ways that the European Union and its member states can scale up support for major refugee receiving countries to improve access to solutions in these places. And each of the country representatives in this panel will focus on a particular question of our research. And you will see that in some cases, and to some extent, the answer to the question applies not only to the country with which the researcher is most familiar, but also resonates with findings from the other countries. And in other cases, some of the information, part of the answer, can be quite specific for that particular context. And I like to invite the audience as well to reflect on the generalizability of the findings and to what extent you feel we can draw useful lessons from these findings here for other contexts, because I'm sure many of you have country-specific experience or knowledge. After these presentations, we will have two external commentators on these findings who are still in the audience. I will introduce them later. Before we start, I would like to thank and acknowledge our institutional partners in the countries of research who have been of great value, not only in carrying out the actual research, the actual data collection, but also in providing lots of support in getting things organized. So Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia, unfortunately not on the table today. Dignity Kwanzaa in Tanzania, Society for Human Rights and Prisoners Aid, SHARP in Pakistan, Amuk University in Jordan, and the Kutafiti in Congo. So thanks very much to all of you. I hope you will convey this message as well to your team in country. Our first panelist today is Dr. Marcus Rudolph, who led together with Fekadu Aduna the Ethiopia research. Marcus works at BIC, the main partner, the consortium lead in this program. The floor is yours. The question that I would like you to kick off with is, from your research, how does the existence of personal networks shape access to solutions for Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia?
Is it working now? Yeah. Red light, green one. So thanks, first of all. And again, sorry for not having presented here our partners from Ethiopia. They would very much like to be here. To some reasons they couldn't, but yeah, you've seen a lot. I don't have brought a PowerPoint, but you've seen a lot of who is in the team and the research that they've been doing in the video clip in the very beginning. And in case you haven't seen it, that's a good reason to have a look at it again. Yeah, you asked about the personal connections, and the answer is that we found this personal networks to be most crucial on a lot of levels. As you've mentioned, we did the research in Ethiopia, right on the border from Eritrea, where the refugees came to. The area is now a zone of conflict, which I will mention a little bit later what it meant today. But what we saw is that the local, translocal, and transnational level for livelihoods, the division of labor that people elaborated in between hosts and refugees, new cooperation initiatives that as well were brought up in collaboration between refugees, people in the camps and outside, for employment, opening businesses, accommodation, or access to education. Something that is specific to Ethiopia, it's called the OCP's out of camp policy, that offer where you are requested to have local as a guarantee. For all of those levels, personal networks were most crucial. And when we talk about personal networks, of course, we have to define what we talk about as well. It's either family networks, regional networks, ethnicity plays a role, your nationality. But the point is that these relationships are dynamic, they're changing, and you will have as well new relationships emerging on the road. So you can't always just look at stuff like nationality or ethnicity beforehand, because it's dynamic, it's changing, and you will, for example, find out what identity matters more in a foreign country by being there, right? So this is something we learn with a lot of migrants. You wouldn't necessarily see yourself as an African or a Latino before you get outside of your region, before you would have rather been stressing your national identity. And within a nation, it's about regional identities. And these are as well as markers that are important for the networks. Maybe we can come back to what we've seen on this different local and transnational levels in detail with the questions, but what I wanted to just say is that you see there as well how different networks play out. Sometimes like in the Afar region, it is something based on ethnicity, where you find the same ethnicity on the other side of the border. Sometimes it's your kind of profession or as a livelihood. So if you're a shepherd, like the Kunama, which is another ethnic group that is on both sides of the border, and you come to a farming community that is your host community, you will find new arrangements in between farmers and shepherds. As we've said, we've seen this OCP policies, out of camp policy, play into already existing, pre-existing ways of accessing the market, for example, in Addis. So people as refugees were not allowed firstly to open businesses, but they did it anyhow. Again, how did they do it? With irregular licenses that were facilitated through personal networks, and the only change that was then occurring with the out of camp policies that they could officially get it recognized. So with all these examples given, I think it's clear that they are all important on multiple levels. As I said, accommodation, livelihoods, but I want to as well have a word of caution, because what we're doing here is a policy recommendation, right? And to not just simplify saying mobility automatically will increase better access. It very often depends, or mostly what we found, on the quality of the networks that you're having. So we were talking about having relatives in the US or Canada, and we had one case where he said, well, I have a cousin in the US, but in difference to my neighbor, who is not my cousin or not family, but the same ethnic group, he's not helping me at all, right? So it's a quality as well of networks. It's not that automatically, because you're mobile and because people you know are elsewhere, that you're in a better condition. As we've said, if you're blocked to be mobile, that's an option less that you're having. But we have to differentiate the quality of networks. That was really a crucial lesson we've learned. And as I said, I would come back to the political situation and the conflict as well in the end. What you saw as well is that there, firstly, the livelihoods that people managed to establish on the other side of the border were very much related to the special status that their co-ethnic group on the other side, the Tigrinya, were having in Ethiopia. And this is now the groups that became the most problematic from being the one in power before. And if this is your network connections to the host, the whole situation turned upside down, right? So you were first in an area where there were 50% of all airports in Ethiopia, and now you're in a blocked region. So this is very important to mention. And the last one as well, with the conflict, we should not forget the causes that we discussed it before with being able to move or not. It's about forced migration, and you're forced because the violence and the human rights violations are making it difficult. And in Ethiopia, we've seen that if this comes after you, if the causes are still existing, and even now invading your country, like we've heard about abductions happening in the camps, then all solutions are as well not working. That will be it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcus. An important lesson to learn: personal connections and also the quality of the connections and how much they count. Our next speaker is Dr. Fawaz Ayub Momani from Jordan, the Yarmouk University. You've been involved in this research on Syrians together as well with the CMI team, who is unfortunately also not present with us today. Can you tell us a bit more about what did you find is the role of networks for Syrian refugees in Jordan, for arriving in Jordan in the first place, and for their lives in Jordan? Which networks are particularly important? You know that the quality is important, but how do these networks look, and do they differ for those living in and out of camps? Because that is an important distinction that you made in the research as well. Thanks.
Good morning. Actually, we have conducted what we call cross-tabulation study for those who are living inside and outside the refugees camps, because we find big differences between two categories. However, during the corona pandemic, 84.4% of Syrian refugees living outside the camps had difficulties living conditions compared to 15% living inside the camps. 82.4% of the Syrian refugees residing in the camps have the intention to return permanently to Syria in the next 2 years, compared to 0% of the refugees residing outside the camps. 20% of the Syrian refugees received financial support from an important person, number one, and 68.6% of them receive emotional support, such as trust, relation, advice on personal or family. 30.9% of Syrian refugees living outside the camps enrolled in educational activities, compared to 67.6% inside the camps. Education options are undersupplied and underutilized. Syrian refugees, especially those in Za'atari, suffer from insecurity and fear of being detained or deported. That this is their perception. Okay. Camp-based refugees have a fewer connection beyond their place of living. Syrian resettlement rates are very low. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think you very clearly show there is a major difference between refugees inside and outside of the camp, not only in the conditions they have, but also in the perspective they have for the future. So very clear intervention, Fawaz. Thank you very much. So we now move on to Dr. Patrick Milabio Kyamusugulwa from the DRC, who did research together with the team on internally displaced persons. So yet again, a slightly different angle which we have here. Dr. Kyamusugulwa, we would like to ask you, how do Congolese IDPs use mobility as a livelihood strategy? Because mobility is one of the key concepts that we are talking about. And what makes this mobility possible and what makes it difficult? And are there other factors that we should take into account there? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Caroline. I will be able to answer the two questions. The first one, but before answering the context of Congo, DRC is a country where you have more IDPs than refugees. Some numbers, you have 4 million IDPs and 500,000 refugees in DRC. These are numbers at the time where we did the research. So we did the research in South Kivu, that's eastern side of the country, neighboring to Rwanda and Burundi. And IDPs came from rural areas, different territories to Bukavu, capital city of the province. How do Congolese IDP use mobility as livelihood strategies? 3 livelihood strategies. One is that IDPs rely on precarious jobs with a low status in the society. The second category is about IDPs who have more financial and social capital. They integrate very easily. The last one is the one which is connected to mobility. This is the group of IDPs who are not fully integrated, and they try to find their own way, their own niche. And the way they do it is to connect with, the area where they're coming from by trying to bring some commodities from the area where they're from to the cities. So you have examples like selling honey, timber, palm oil, charcoal. And that's also how IDPs contribute to local economy. So what makes this possible and what makes it difficult? What is possible is 2 factors. One is that, mobility is seen as another option after the failure of connectivity in host communities. And then IDPs, they try to find other way to survive in host communities by going back to where they came from or by choosing other areas where they can, find livelihood or opportunities. How it works, the research found that there are 2 concepts here. One is what we call chain of hospitality. It means IDPs is connected to many people, and it all depends on whether the contact is strong enough to bring change in the life of IDP. We also found another concept which we call this new formation of networks. It means that contacts are not the same, and IDPs rely on different contacts, and sometimes is able to create new contacts. So that's how the networks works, and that's how IDPs really try to find out how to survive. So what makes it difficult? 2 factors. One is insecurity in area where IDPs came from. As long as insecurity is still in these areas, IDPs have difficulty to go back to where they came. The second reason is the shame of being labeled as a failure case. When you leave a rural area, you go to the cities. People expect in rural area that you would change and you wouldn't come back. When you come back without anything, so you are ashamed and people are crying on you saying, wow, this is a failure case. So many IDPs don't want to go back. So some ways to move forward, 3. One is it's better to identify IDPs and refugees, how they live, what are their connections, which families they are connected to, churches, association, and try when it's possible to strengthen these connections. That we call it chain of identification and integration of IDPs. The second strategy is to create space for IDPs, refugees in the periphery of the city, where they always live in difficult conditions. And I think assistance should be, directed toward this to try to get them decent physical spaces. And the last one is to try to end conflict and create an enabling environment for IDPs to return home. And this, I think, at state level, the government should be able to work on ending the conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I think it's a clear message as well that shows that mobility can help IDPs. And we could imagine that if refugees wouldn't be hampered and restricted by border regimes, they may use similar strategies to find their way out. I think it's also striking that you mentioned the creation of new networks, which was also mentioned by the Ethiopia research, which I think is important to realize that people are not stuck with the contacts they have. They can also expand these contacts. So thanks very much. We now move to Mr. Muhammad Javed, Director of SHARP in Pakistan, involved in the research on Afghan refugees in Pakistan. Of course, a very timely situation at the moment. Afghans have been displaced in Pakistan for over 4 decades now. And how would you characterize the intergroup relation between Afghans and Pakistanis in Pakistan over time? And how have these dynamics influenced the prospects for Afghans to manage their day-to-day lives? Because you could imagine if you are in a host society for so long, it also changes the relations and people do create new networks. Could you reflect on this?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, you are quite right that Pakistan is hosting millions of Afghans from last 40 years. It's more than 40 years now. And I mean, the situation has not been pretty much fine for the refugees just because of the deteriorated security situation in that particular area, region. Especially coming back, coming back to this relationship. You know, this is a unique relationship between host communities and refugee communities in Pakistan. And this is always quoted in different conferences and different meetings that they share a very valuable relationship. Because Pakistan doesn't have a refugee law, and we have not even signed a refugee convention or its protocol, 1967 protocols even. Still, refugees have great relationship with the host communities, and they even give their guarantees if they are arrested, and they're just because of the social and cultural values they share together. And if they are arrested, the local or the host community members offer their guarantees. And if they want to start any business, they even give guarantees to the local authorities for hiring shops or buying bikes or cars or any other means of transportation. So, but I mean, with the passage of time, it depends on the security situation. Sometimes these issues are escalated just because of the tensions between the two nations, sometimes through the media and other things what happened due to this regime change and other things. But we have got during this research, we came to know about so many things that in one incident, a refugee reported in Karachi that he used to work in a local market, and know he's an old man, but still, sometimes if he needs money, he goes to the market, and the people, the host community members often offer them their help, and the same is the case with the Afghans. If they are well off, they will be contributing towards these Pakistani people. We have got one example here that somebody from Afghan community member, an elder, Afghan elder, provided 50,000 Pak rupees for a scholarship for the young people, Pakistani people in Pakistan University. And even services are free for Afghan refugees in Pakistan. They can go to school, they can go to any public health service, and there they are they are given as to Pakistanis. And but looking at all these things, things has been changed over the couple of months, and after the regime change, especially in Kabul, and so many people starting pouring into Pakistan, and we have almost registered nearly 200,000 people in last couple of months. And but I mean, we're still looking for decisions at the highest level to accommodate more positively the new arrivals. But we see that the priority of European countries have also changed due to Ukraine crisis, and through this platform, because Pakistan have its own political and social and economic and security challenges. Still, government of Pakistan and people of Pakistan have been supporting and accommodating generously to such a huge population. And through this platform, and I would also like to request and that the EU countries and other developed countries must come forward to share burden of refugees, refugee hosting countries like Pakistan, and as developing countries have their own social, economic, and security challenges. And developed countries and the EU member state should also revisit their migration and asylum policies and should be more open towards Afghans for resettlement for Afghan refugees from Pakistan and other areas, as resettlement is not open for Afghans since 2016. So this shows the discrimination clear against these Afghans. But I mean, they should allocate more resources and towards improvement of infrastructure development and in different sector providing who are providing services, free services to Afghan refugees. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mudassar. And I think your call is a clear call to the EU, which is very fair. And you may wonder whether actually the Ukrainians coming to Europe make Europe also realize how much burden is taken and how much efforts are taken by countries like Pakistan and Jordan in providing shelter and in providing all this support to refugees, because now Europe is seeing what it actually does to countries if there's these large numbers of people coming. So I think it's a fair call to action as well to the EU member states, basically, and also to us in general, in a way. Thank you. Last but not least, Jane Mary Ruundwa. Move again to Africa, to Tanzania in this case. Jane Mary is the co-founder and executive director of Dignity Kwanza. And the findings in Tanzania are not really based on research, but more on the work that you do with your clients in Tanzania, with Congolese and Burundian refugees. And having, well, if you see what if you observe your clients, basically, how do aid and asylum regimes for you shape the networking or alliance building of refugees and vulnerable migrants in Dar, according to you?
Thank you, Caroline. I'll start by saying that first of all, aid and asylum regimes shape refugee movements and stay in and within the country. And in return, that shapes their networking and alliance building. So the notable feature of our asylum regime in Tanzania nowadays is restrictive encampment, very strict encampment. And I think this is notable because it's totally the opposite of what Tanzania was known for in the 1980s. Because of this restrictive or this strict encampment policy, one of the outcomes that we see is that we have very few refugees who are able to reside out of refugee camps legally. So due to other challenges within the asylum system, refugees are still forced to leave camps, but without following the procedures, which are not very easy. So like lack of livelihood opportunities is one of the reasons. So only a few refugees are able to leave camps with permissions, and these are the few refugees who would be under the purview of the refugee protection and will be able to get support as refugees outside camps. Studies estimate that there could be over 10,000 urban refugees in Dar es Salaam and other cities. So all these really depend on their personal and networks and alliances to be able to navigate their lives within the city. So how are they managing to build these relationships? Without the formal protection of the asylum regime, they rely mostly on trust. So they try to maintain networks with people who are close to them, the people who they trust, such as relatives and friends, either within the city or back in the camps, back home, or even abroad. And these networks and alliances are very important in different aspects of lives of these refugees, be it economic, social, and psychological. They also manage to identify places they feel safe to network, like churches, organizations like Dignity Kwanza and few others in Dar es Salaam, but also places of their work like markets, and also identify few people that they trust who are not necessarily fellow refugees that they can interact and network with. They also try to have something to offer, such as skills, also good behavior, friendliness, so that they are likable. They also try to blend in. Learning the Tanzanian Swahili is most of the common way of blending in, so that they can hide their identities. But they always try to find ways to regularize their status so that they can openly engage with people. And they also take advantage of technology as a tool for networking. So I would like to share a story of Hazina, one of our clients, who has managed well to form alliances that has made her able to do business in Dar es Salaam. So this is a quote from her. She says, "I get a very hard time when instructing someone to do something. For example, to come early at the salon. They tell me, why bothered? Will you be paid for this? Why are you stretching yourself so much as if it is your business? It is very hard to compose myself and not tell them that this salon is mine. I know that I should keep on doing that because I don't know how they will use that information against me if they come to know that the salon is mine." So Hazina, who is now a young woman, fled to Tanzania when she was only 17, accompanied by her young brother, after losing her parents and also getting separated from her other two siblings. She was supported by pastors and churches, and then until when Dignity Kwanza was able to reconnect her with her uncle who lives in Austria. Due to some challenges in the asylum procedure, she and her brother were not able to be registered as refugees. And hence, even after finding their uncle, they were not able to join him in Austria. So before finding her uncle, Hazina was working as a freelancer hairdresser. She would be called by clients on her phone and follow them where they are and plait their hair. She used social media as an advertising platform for her business. After finding her uncle sent her money that she used to start this salon business. But then another requirement was to register this business, and she couldn't do that because she's not registered herself. So she had to use a client of hers who is a star in Tanzania, local star, to register this business and get licensed on her behalf. So the business is registered in the name of this local star, and Hazina has to pose as if she is an employee. So that's why she was sharing the difficulty of managing other employees who feel that she's just their fellow employee and she's not supposed to manage them. So Hazina is now able to pay for her brother's school fees, and her dream is to start a school for a beauty school. So just to finish, what can you do here? So although urban refugees manage to cope and form informal alliances with host community members, solutions must be found for them to avoid negative impact of the prolonged marginalization, such as risk of statelessness coming from hiding their identities, children's rights violation, especially rights to education, because some children are not able to be enrolled in school, and also human trafficking, because these people, especially women and children, can become victims of human trafficking. So what can you do? Continue to support more research and advocacy projects like this one that raise awareness of the existence of this population and that seek to change the narrative about them. Also support programs that empower or work with the population to access social and economic rights. and promote positive refugee and host relations for smooth integration, but also include this population in the general human rights and refugee protection discussions with host governments and support those governments in finding solutions.
Thank you very much. And I think it's interesting, Jane Mary, to see you mention a number of functions that the network can have, economic, social, psychological, which actually resonate with the limbos that Albert was referring to. So there it seems that indeed there is a solution to find in looking into networks. So thanks for bringing that up. I would like the audience to keep your questions for a little while because we still have two speakers that I would like to invite now. And if the people online already have questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat here if you want. So I will first give the floor to Ms. Delphine Drapeau of the Directorate General for International Partnerships of the European Commission, where you work as a policy officer and program manager. And before joining INPA, you've had wide experience in the field. So I think the stories of refugees and displaced people are not unfamiliar to you. Well, you've heard a lot. We would like to hear from you. How do you see these concepts of mobility and connectivity also in relation to DJ INPA's work? Thank you.
Thank you. Does this work? You can hear me? Yeah, perfect. It's my pleasure to be here today on the occasion of this final conference. This concept of mobility and of connectivity are indeed very relevant to the work of the European Commission and of DG INPA in particular. There's many aspects that are of interest, and a few minutes won't do justice to the depths of research that you've all conducted, but I'll go over a few aspects. The first one relates to the importance of research to inform policy. The NDICI Global Europe instrument, which is the financial instrument for the period 2021-2027, is really about giving us the means to walk the talk across all EU engagement, including on migration and forced displacement. By placing a target on migration and forced displacement of 10%, the EU has recognized the long-term impact of forced displacement on host countries as a development challenge and a dimension of its foreign policy commitments. On forced displacement, we continue to work in line with the 2016 communication Lives in Dignity, which is about forced displacement and development. We work also in line with the EU consensus on development, contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals and its principle to leave no one behind. In this sense, the EU development funding is really policy driven, and the EU is striving to ensure that its financial support is an effective and efficient vehicle to contribute to achieve its policy objective. Your different pieces of research inform us at headquarters, but also in the EU delegation in the relevant country on the policies that are the most conducive to promoting self-reliance, livelihood, the dignity of forcibly displaced persons, as well as supporting host countries and host communities. So this helps us in our interaction with partners and in developing programs as well. On livelihoods in particular, strengthening the ability to build, maintain, and restore livelihoods of society, communities, individuals is embedded in the EU strategic approach to resilience in its external action. The EU commitment to promote economic opportunities, secure livelihood, and self-reliance for refugees and their hosts is enshrined in the 2016 communication Lives in Dignity that I mentioned earlier. It recognizes that refugees and IDPs are productive individuals with skills, with assets to contribute to the economy and to the society of those countries and communities. As your research pointed out, one of the most effective ways to reduce the aid dependence of forcibly displaced and to increase their self-reliance is to give them access to labor markets. However, without development opportunities, the predominant care and maintenance aid dependence model undermines opportunities for refugees and IDPs to become self-reliant. It also likely results in an increase in the informal economy, resulting in many issues, including tensions between host communities and displaced persons. So these are things that, in line with my previous point, need to be addressed in political dialogue. So we cooperate with strategic partners in assisting host government and authorities to formulate policy that give forcibly displaced persons opportunities to become self-reliant. Development cooperation can also help by providing not only employment possibility, but also capacity building assistance to host country. In the previous financing period, the support to the livelihood of forcibly displaced persons was a priority. There was a lot of support through the various trust funds. And this is remaining very much a priority in the period to come. The effectiveness of this action to boost resilience and self-reliance depend heavily on the extent of the buy-in from the host communities and the displaced people themselves, which brings me to my next points. On relationship with the host community, again, as per our policy, the Lives in Dignity communication, we recognize that host communities also have growing development needs, that we should strive to create a win-win scenario for both displaced and their host communities and to reduce the impact for the host communities. We should also support interactions between forcibly displaced persons and host communities. So we recognize the importance of responding lying in a needs-based approach and non-discrimination. So we support more and more integrated response assisting all people in an area, the so-called area-based approach, according to needs, not only those displaced, but also host communities and those affected by the crisis, but not displaced, in the most coherent and comprehensive way. So we have actions dedicated to forced displacement, but also a number of actions where forcibly displaced will be integrated and mainstreamed. On the engagement and participation of population, your research point to the agency of forcibly displaced persons and to the role of this in their self-reliance. This brings me to the need for us to facilitate and to strengthen forcibly displaced and host community engagement and active participation, meaning participation in the planning, in the decision-making, and in the management of programs and development plans. There's two aspects of our work that do not relate solely in forced displacement, but were mentioned in the introductory panel and that are very relevant to mobility and connectivity. Sorry. And these are remittances and diaspora. On remittances, global remittances directly affect 1 billion people. That's 200 million migrant workers sending help for food, for education, etc., to 800 million family members in more than 125 developing countries. The European Union strives to promote cheaper, faster, and more secure remittances. So we fully support SDG 10 on reducing remittances cost to 3% by 2030. And there's already some progress in that. We've taken a number of commitments in this area in support to the finance facility on remittances of IFAD, with the United Nations Development Capital Fund and with the World Bank. On diaspora, we engage directly with diaspora organizations. We working in country of origin for capacity building at global level. We launched the EU Global Diaspora Facility to facilitate engagement and cooperation between countries of origin and their diaspora on all continents. We also organized the yearly Global Future Forum on Diaspora Engagement. And finally, on development matters, priorities and expectations of diaspora groups are increasingly being taken into account. So all this to tell you that we recognize the value of research undertaken, and we closely look at this to inform our policies.
Thank you very much. And I think there's an article by Oliver Bakewell that talks about the importance of also doing policy irrelevant research to avoid reproducing all the categories that policymakers use. But I think in a way, I'm also relieved to see that our research does resonate quite a bit with policy and that we do have relevance also there. So thanks for that. Thanks also for bringing in the host communities, which we didn't discuss in our panel so much, but we certainly looked into this as well. So it's good that you're bringing it up on the table as well. Thank you. Our next speaker is Jens Heeseman, who is currently seconded with OECD by UNHCR, has extensive experience with UNHCR, also in various countries. We were just talking about this already. And I would like to ask you to reflect a bit more on OECD's work on social protection and the role of inclusion as we speak about solutions and how that resonates with our findings.
Okay, thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for having me here. It was a privilege to be able to listen live to the findings of the research. And I found that really interesting. And it's very much carrying some of the more recent policy messages on inclusion and that the displaced themselves are indeed economic actors. And I think that's really the new thing here, that we move away from more paternalistic or parallel aid model. So social protection, I'll jump straight into it. So why did we look at social protections? Social protection systems, and that includes social assistance, social insurance, and labor market interventions, such as skills training or job referral and so on. They can be a very pragmatic bridge between humanitarian and development interventions. So if the forcibly displaced are included there, it can lead to quasi solutions in the medium to longer term, which are possibly even also more cost efficient in terms of the assistance provision than running parallel assistance programs. But I'll unpack that a little more. In a way, so from our view, they're a pathway to inclusion, and that's a good entry point to look at social protection. But there are other sectors which are equally important, that is education, health, but now focusing on this one. What social protection systems do in a country, they have a critical impact on the social and national cohesion of a country. So they're a political tool in most countries. They can meet long-term basic needs and build self-reliance in a way. It also supports gradual integration and the transition from emergency delivery towards becoming regular citizens in a society. So what I'll do in this short presentation is to run through the conceptual model on how we see social protection in relation to forced displacement, the forced displacement cycle, and then go a little bit into the study where we looked at 12 countries, where we then said, okay, and how far is this actually happening, social protection for the forcibly displaced? So conceptually, if we look at the forced displacement cycle, there's the emergency phase when mass displacement can occur. There is the protracted phase, which has been the focus of the TRAFIG project. There's the solutions phase. And then you could add, a fragile context or preparedness phase before displacement occurs. And there are specific interventions which are useful in each phase of the cycle. So if we look at the emergency phase, from the humanitarian side, of course, we're looking at a parallel emergency response. But from the system side, social protection, it would be the activation of shock responsive mechanisms in social protection. So to ideally, as early as possible, to include the forcibly displaced there. In protracted displacement, we move towards a gradual inclusion from parallel humanitarian responses to social safety nets and systems such as, for example, if you take a social insurance model, health insurance. And it has been done in some countries that refugees, for example, were included in national health insurance schemes. So they don't need to rely on medical NGOs to get their health care, but they can, like any other citizen, go to the public health system. In that phase, the humanitarian actors, they would adjust their delivery systems, especially when it comes to cash, to state systems, social welfare systems, so that eventually they can be fully handed over from humanitarian actors to more state-led systems. In the solutions phase, then the state-led systems fully kick in. So this is, I'm describing conceptually how it would work. I'm not saying this is happening in the ideal world. And what's interesting, because some of the social protection is contributory, especially the insurance schemes. So if the forcibly displaced are allowed to work, and if they can get access to these insurance schemes, eventually they can perpetually cover their own costs. And that eventually is becoming cheaper than or more cost effective, which does matter because the needs outweigh the resources available. than a perpetual humanitarian parallel system. It also values, again, the agency of the refugees and the IDPs themselves. So there's a lot of potential in this. There's a long way to go to make that happen. Now, in a preparedness context, before it occurs, oh no, I'm running out of time, badly probably. Oh, okay, oh God. It's capacity building of these social protection systems, which would be important. So we looked at 12 countries, including 3 deep dive countries where we did a lot of interviews in Iraq, Sudan, and Uganda, to see in how far is this happening. And we looked at the jure access to social protection and the de facto access. In a nutshell, what we found is that the jure access, the legal access to social protection systems, is actually quite good. I mean, IDPs are nationals of their own country in any case. So nothing, but there are even countries who have specific legislation referring to access to social protection for IDPs. And even in the 12 countries we looked at for refugees, it was not so bad. In most countries, refugees had access to some form of social protection system, maybe not the full scale, but some part. So legally, the legal framework was not the problem. But then we tried to, with the study, to find the de facto access. So how many people actually benefited from social protection in these 12 countries? And that was very problematic. In a nutshell, we found hardly or very slim, less than 10% of the displaced, or sometimes in most cases less than 5%, actually had access to these social protection systems. So what is legally in principle possible, de facto is not happening. So this was one of the important findings of our study. Now we looked at some enablers and challenges towards the inclusion in these systems. So what did we find? And I'm not going to go through all of them because I know there's no time. Political stability was definitely one enabler, but it's also the political instability is an obstacle. So for example, in Sudan, where I actually worked before my current assignments with the OECD, with the military takeover in the country, the changes in the social protection legislation were completely put on hold. The country was planning, the transition government was planning to bring out a new social protection law. It was meant to deliberately state access for refugees and IDPs. But when then the military coup happened, the military takeover, these plans were put on hold. I think the teams were also exchanged in the ministries. So we don't actually know if this legislative change, the Euro change, is happening. Also, what it also did, this instability now in Sudan, is putting into question some of the development financing flows to the country, which could have helped that inclusion into social protection systems. So this is just to illustrate one example how it can affect. So political instability is not conducive to these kind of approaches. There were many others, and you can eventually look them up once we publish this study, so I'm not going to go into detail. There was a lot of discussion here about formality, informality in work. Informality is actually a challenge for the inclusion in social protection systems. Because with an informal labor market, it's difficult to generate contributory access because people don't dare to register their business or cannot. So that's a real challenge for such an approach to work. 5 policy recommendations we drew from this. So broadly, we see a lot of potential in incorporating refugees and IDPs in national social protection planning and policy. So we encourage to go further on this, and that's host governments, but also development partners support that. What we noticed is sometimes in the host countries, especially in low and middle income countries, the hesitation is that the inclusion comes with also a bill. If we include refugees and IDPs in social assistance, this will cost the state more money than before. So I think donors can incentivize this by providing multi-year funding towards this inclusion. To give the host country a certain prospect that at least for some time this bill will be covered until it becomes a revolving system, hopefully. Coordination is important, and there's a lot more we can do within host governments, because this comes a lot also from my own experience working with Unhcr in large refugee host countries. Often the refugee management side is quite separate and fragmented from other line ministries. So to get the Refugee Commission to talk to the Education Ministry is not often that straightforward. And it's the same with social protection. So there's a lot more work internally in governments to do. Then the inclusion of refugees and IDPs in mainstream data systems. If you have a social registry or a social protection beneficiary database, people will be targeted who are in that database. If people are not registered into that database, it's very hard to even start finding them or identifying them with the targeting. Often the refugee registration systems are separate from the foundational individual identity data management systems in countries, and that is a challenge. So what we recommend is that these bridges between the displaced identity management systems and the mainstream population identity management systems, they need to be overcome to facilitate that inclusion. Finally, on the inclusion as such, that needs to be monitored as well. What we found in this study, it was very hard to even find data on the actual inclusion of the refugees and IDPs in social protection systems, because the data is not disaggregated by displacement status. So what we recommend is that aggregator databases and government databases to specifically stipulate where they have included refugees or IDPs in their programs, because at the moment it's actually very hard to establish that. On the wider policy work, and then I'll leave it there if you allow me to just add that point.
Just a one-liner then.
Yeah. I mean, the recent policies, the recent forced displacement policies, the Global Compact on Refugees, then there's the UN Secretary General's Action Agenda on Internal Displacement. And there is, from the OECD side, a DAC-INCAF common position on comprehensive responses to refugee situations. These are some of the main recent policy instruments for forced displacement. What they have in common is this inclusion agenda, that a whole of government approach should be used, and that refugees and IDPs benefit from the inclusion in broader development programs, and that's why the 10% target of the EU is so fantastic to hear about. And it's a very important statement. So we're working more on this. What we will do in the next step of this is to do a baseline of the actual inclusion of refugees and IDPs in national development plans of the host countries and low middle income countries, and the same on the donor development strategy side. We will check in how far forced displacement, like on the EU example, which is a good example, has actually been incorporated in development cooperation. So I'll leave it there. So there's a lot of potential in this and other sectors, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess this is also a reminder or call to all of us to look at our data also from the social inclusion perspective, which we maybe haven't done so much because our focus has been on mobility and connectivity. And listening to you now, I think we've now been calling policymakers to take a people-centered approach, an area-based approach, and a whole of government approach. So they will be busy. I think it's interesting also to see to what extent our approaches actually differ, because we do use different terms, but maybe the difference in practice, what we mean with it, doesn't necessarily differ so much. I would like to have a second round now with Delphine. I'm sure, well, I know you've been looking at the policy handbook and the nice takeaways that have been also presented throughout the break, and I think you've seen several of them. I would like to invite you to reflect a little bit on these and how you can see they can help also INPA, it's a difficult name to pronounce, how can it help to move the work forward? Thank you.
Sure, so I'm going to link some of your key takeaways to INPA's work, or more broadly to EU's work. I'm not going to take them in order and not cover them all, but I'll still start by the first one, which is protracted displacement is a side effect, if not a deliberate consequence of policy choice. So that relates very much to the policy-first approach of the EU that I mentioned in my first intervention. So I won't go in details on this one. The second one is your key takeaway 7, welcoming displaced people should not come at the expense of host countries and communities. Here again, it relates to the 2018 Global Compact on Refugees, and it's called to burden and responsibility sharing, to which the EU contributed. And the EU continues to be committed to the Global Refugee Forum process. A translation of this commitment is reflected in the Global Europe, so the financial instrument I mentioned before, with the 10% external assistance dedicated to migration and forced displacement. The third key takeaway is takeaway 10, work across policy silo to ensure that the sum is greater than its parts. And that relates very much to two policy approach of the EU. One is the humanitarian development and peace nexus, and the second one is the Team Europe approach. So the EU is committed to an integrated nexus approach, and important steps were made in operationalizing and integrating it in programming in a considerable number of fragile and conflict-affected countries. One in the many initiatives in this regard are the regional refugee support platforms. The EU is an active member of the 3 regional support platforms that were launched at the Global Refugee Forum in 2019. All of these platforms have been designed in a humanitarian development and peace nexus spirit, fully aligned with the EU policy approach. These are the support to the IGAD in the Horn of Africa, the MIRS process in Central America, and the solution strategy for Afghan refugees, the SSR. The support provided is both political and financial through humanitarian assistance and development cooperation. On the Team Europe approach, so Team Europe consists of the European Union, EU member states, including their implementing agency and public development banks, as well as the European Investment Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So the EU, through this approach, is strengthening its cooperation with member states and promoting a Team Europe approach, and in particular Team Europe initiative, and there will be a few on forced displacement itself, to allow for better coordination and complementarity. Fourth, it connects to your key takeaway 6. IDPs require more attention and offer valuable lessons for helping refugees. So this is very important considering the ever-increasing number of IDPs. We were at more than 55 at the end of 2020 already. And of course, the severe impact for individuals and society, which too often is not matched by attention and funding. So the EU is fully engaged in helping IDPs throughout the world and stepping up commitment by including internal displacement in a more substantive manner in the Global Europe programming for the next 7 years. The EU was also among the first advocates of the idea of establishing the high-level panel on internal displacement that gave its recommendation in the fall of last year. We remain engaged in the process to generate political will needed for a more effective response through the United Nations Secretary General Action Agenda. Finally, I wanted to mention key takeaways 8, leverage individual opportunities so that displaced person can stay connected, and 9, nothing about displaced persons without displaced person. Indeed, both relate to a small but meaningful initiative that we developed in INPA with our partner UNOPS, which is the Lives in Dignity Grant Facility. It's geared toward engaging in development-led and whole-of-society response to forced displacement situation. To this end, the facility will allocate 24 million between 2021 and 2025 to a diverse group of implementing partners, with notably national and local authorities, the private sector, academia, etc., eligible to apply. The facility focuses on 5 thematic areas: economic livelihood development, spatial planning, housing and settlement, integrated services delivery, protection in development, and addressing disaster and climate-related human mobility. All projects funded need to address at least 2 of these themes. There's a focus on innovation, and it comprises an equal partnership between at least 2 entities, one of which needs to be a local actor. While not all the projects have been selected so far, we expect very strong participation of affected population at all levels. We expect also innovative and virtual approaches, in particular in the area of education, and an important involvement of local actors that are not typically involved in these types of projects. So we'll be looking forward in the coming months and years to share the follow-up on the implementation of these innovative projects.
Good timing. Well, thanks very much. I think it's nice to see that so many of our takeaways do have already some reality. And personally, working on IDPs in Congo, I'm especially happy to hear that there is also more momentum to do something on them. I have a final question to Mr. Hitteman. Also in reference to Jane Mary's example of Hasina, who uses technology, ICT, to set up her business and to promote her business. And we did look into ICT as a solution as well. So I'm curious to hear to what extent this also comes up in your work at OECD, the ICT as an element, as a part of a possible pathway, if we call it.
Thank you. I mean, certainly the access to ICT means, and that often means SIM cards to start with, is part of the inclusion agenda, if you wish. So, and it's actually a starting point, like it is for many of us in people living not in a displaced status, but living normally. It's a starting point to do anything. So this is really important. And I've worked on some of these programs during previous assignments with Unhcr, where we try to facilitate that access to ICT in various forms. So I'll share a little bit from that. What it does, the access to ICT means, I mean, first it's the whole networking idea, which is at the heart of TRAFIG. That is facilitated by access to SIM cards and the internet. And to stay in touch with your networks and your connections, but it doesn't end there. It could possibly give access to remote work. There are increasingly opportunities to work online in certain sectors. So if you have a stable connection, you can do, you can actually work further away than where you physically are. It can give you access to learning, education delivered through internet means. It can give you access to specialized skills trainings. And we have organized for refugees in certain countries these online skills training seminars. And it can give you access to financial inclusion in countries where mobile money is used a lot, especially in Eastern Horn of Africa, for example, where this is very prominent. Unless you have a SIM card, you will not be able to use mobile money. So it's a key entry point. And many other examples on marketing was just mentioned and so on. So what can actors do to facilitate this ICT access for the forcibly displaced population? So what can we actually practically do? So I will just try to point out some specific pathways which can be used. One is the legal dimension. Ideally, we want to enable, let's stay with the example of refugees to purchase a SIM card. And it's not so much that they don't have I've implemented pilot projects to distribute smartphones. It's not the phones. And sometimes it's not even the credits, because people do have some resources to pay for that, although that can be a bottleneck. But it's legally being allowed to purchase a SIM card. So what we did in Uganda, for example, we negotiated with the Uganda Telecoms Commission that refugees can use their refugee ID card, which is issued by the government. There's a standard form for that to purchase a SIM card. Because often you need to show some form of national ID document to purchase a SIM card. And that negotiation was very, very important. It opened the way that 1 million refugees could now legally own SIM cards. Before that was not possible, or was left unclear, because they don't have Ugandan identity documents. Another element is the logistical aspect. Often the large refugee populations, they stay in remote or isolated areas. If you know, the Jordan example of Zatri came up, and there are many others, or the camps in northern Uganda. Often there are no no masts. The telecoms operators don't have these emitter masts. So we worked actually quite a lot with the telephone companies, the telcos, that they either were sending remote masts or new masts to these areas, giving preferential access and preferential rates for SIM cards to the refugees. The key negotiation point there is that it's a win-win situation for them and for the refugees. They, of course, they are as a private company legitimately looking for a business model. So what we try to explain to them is the scale of the situation in these areas, the number of people who may possibly use the services and buy SIM cards and then also spend there. And then they actually did put up additional masts so that these areas were covered with voice and internet networks. Finally, there's assistance elements which can be implemented. It's the setup of internet cafes. We had refugee-led projects where refugees were sort of opening their own club. We just provided them with the equipment and the resources to pay for an internet connection. And then they would sort of organize skills training sessions or networking sessions with the refugee community. So that was quite useful. Providing ICT equipments can help as well. SIM card phone special distributions, although my experience there was the SIM card is actually the most important part, not the phone. Most people actually own a phone. And then cash transfers, preferably a non-conditional cash transfers to pay for credit over time. Yeah. So these are some of the relevant interventions which can be done to make that.
Yeah, thanks very much. There are certainly things that we don't think about so much, but that if you don't have citizenship status, you can't get a phone, a SIM card is already a major barrier for many people that we may not always be so aware of. Thanks very much. I don't want to dominate the discussion more, so the floor is open for any questions from the audience. I will first take questions from the room here and then from the online audience. So please feel free. Or if some of the other panelists has a question to Jens or to Delphine or the other way around, you may also, of course, raise your hand.
Well, I have a question that is addressed both to Fawaz and Jane Mary. You have in both your presentations, you have pointed at gaps for urban refugees in access to rights, to education and services. And very often, and you pointed out, Jane Mary, that it's very much the Tanzanian government's policy to keep refugees out of the city. And my question is, what work can be done also on the European side to convince governments that it's worthwhile to provide these rights and also set up services, establish services and provide access to education, labor markets, and so for refugees who are displaced in urban centers. Thank you.
Yeah, Father Bashtar. Okay. Actually, I can say that most of the basic needs are available at the camps. So some of the Syrian refugees, those who left the camps, they come back again because living in the urban and cities, is going to create a problem for them because they would like to provide these basic needs in addition to the apartments. So this is because, it's a restricted area and, most of the NGOs are mainly working, because it's a centralized in the two camps, Za'atari and Al-Azraq. Okay.
Thank you. So one way, usually governments want to see what is in for them. So one way is to use the security angle that sometimes doesn't work very well, but it's in the interest of the government, any government, to know who is in the country and what they are doing. So if they don't do anything with this group of people, it's not good for the government as well. So it's better to ease the restrictions so that people can live in urban areas by following procedures. But we believe if the procedures are easy, they'll follow. And through our work with this population, their biggest request is always legal status. They don't want to hide themselves. They're not running away from being recognized. It's just that the available options are just too difficult for them to pursue. there was a time when the government offered a special kind of permit called peasant permit. It was designed for peasants, people in the borders along the border areas, who would cross during the farming season and then work and then go back. But then they decided to extend it to other people in the urban areas to recognize them, and it would help them to do small businesses. And many of our clients went for that. And even those who were not able to afford came to our organization, and we supported them. So this shows that they really want to be recognized. So it's just that the government needs to put simple procedures in place. Again, another way is it's human rights. These are human beings. We're talking about rights to work, freedom of movement, but children, we're talking about children as well. And another angle is to avoid future negative impacts. I mentioned some statelessness. Now we're not seeing it in Tanzania yet. It's coming up slowly because we have started rolling out national IDs. We didn't have national IDs before. So having a large population of people who are undocumented creates risk of statelessness in the future. So these are some of the lines that we use in our advocacy with the government, but mostly is also benefits, because these people, if they're able, we have seen the example of Azina, what she's able to do even with the restrictions. So if these restrictions are waived, definitely they can do more and benefit not just themselves, but also the host and the government as well.
Yes, thanks very much. It's a clear call, I think, to recognize people as people, also at a legal level. First question, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, more than a question, it's perhaps a comment on what Mr. Hesseman was saying related to the access to digital connection and how social media and access to social media can enable opportunities. Even if I think it's important to underline that, we also need to take into account the other side, right? Not only this euphoric side about the use of ICTs, but I mean, relating to the example of mobile work that you mentioned, there is also digital exploitation. So how do we protect people from being digitally exploited in relation to human trafficking, for instance? Critical question. We want to respond to that with a fair question, I think.
No, absolutely not an easy answer to that either. I mean, I think in every area of work, it needs to be regulated, and there need to be safeguards in place that this exploitation is not happening. Some of these are transnational issues, because indeed you could give access to work or to a smuggling network, as you say, which is in another country than where the person is located. So I think international actors have a role in possibly providing frameworks for this, or providing advice or standards to the people engaging in these in the internet and social media. But my view would be this risk of exploitation comes everywhere in any form of work. So it shouldn't be the stop of using that as an approach and facilitating that more. But clearly, it can't just be a free-for-all. It needs to be regulated, it needs to be supported, it needs to be specific vulnerabilities need to be mapped out, that it's not leading to negative coping strategies and so on. Sure, I can only acknowledge the risk, say that it's managed, but for me, it wouldn't be an argument to not look at these kind of approaches in a broader assistance and response program.
Another question. I guess we take this question and then we have a look at the online questions.
Right. Thank you so much to all the panelists. And I've got a question to Mr. Rapport. I think many of the things you mentioned are, of course, extremely sensible, and most of the people here are in agreement with it. But while you were speaking, I was thinking of other trends in the European Union and also coming from the European Union institutions, which are in tension with that. So, for example, the way we are treating Ukrainian refugees or displaced people. and the way we treat refugees coming from other countries, but also within the European Union, some institutions pushing towards some policy solutions and other institutions pushing towards other policy solutions. And even within the Commission, of course, some DGs are probably in favor of some approaches and other DGs are in favor of other approaches. So it's a bit of a million-dollar question. How do we square all those different approaches and all those different tendencies in a way that doesn't harm the refugees? Thank you.
I feel maybe that's maybe more of a question for the next panel because it's very related to policies within the EU. So I think there they'll be best placed to respond on that. Maybe just to say that the communication, which is the main policy document on refugees, on forced displacement and development that I mentioned, the Lives in Dignity, it's an inter-service document. So it's not just a DG INPA or DG ECO document, it's inter-services. So there's a lot of exchanges between the different DGs. And as I said, with the Team Europe approach, also a lot of exchanges with member states and development banks. But for the rest, I'll leave it to the second panel.
Thanks, that's fine, I guess. I'm looking at Caitlin for the online audience questions.
Yes, we have two here from the online audience. The first relates to Jordan, asking about the refugee camps in Jordan and why refugees staying there seem to be doing relatively better than those living outside the camps, as opposed to many other camps globally. And if we have some feedback related to Jordan and I guess also the comparative perspective. The second question looks more broadly at refugee protection worldwide and asks, is it fair to ask UNHCR to return to a classic role as the worldwide coordinator for refugee protection, rather than a current role of management and observation?
Okay, Thomas, you go first, and then
sure.
the others may step in.
Yeah, regarding the refugees, the population of the Syrian refugees in the camps, they are representing 20% only. So we have two camps, Zaatari and Al-Azraq. At the beginning of the crisis, most of the Jordanian, they host the Syrian refugees at their homes because, in the southern part of Syria, there is, tribal families between Syria and, Jordan. So when it's became on the large scale, there's no way to adopt huge number of refugees. So they started with the UNHCR to build the refugee camps. But as I told you, 20% of them, they are at the refugee camps. Those who do not have access to go to the urban areas. Okay.
Thanks. To give the floor about the UNHCR question, I know you both have experience working with UNHCR, so you may be well positioned to do, but I think I would also like to hear the perspective from the researchers and how they've seen this with refugees, especially. I don't know, maybe Mudassar, you want to reflect on it? Because I think you do have a critical position about the international community. Do you want to reflect a bit on that question?
Thank you very much. I would rather like to ask one question from this. Yeah. And I've been after the regime change in Kabul and what kind of efforts being made at European countries are making towards like supporting of Pakistan and to accommodate the people who are coming, as by this time it's been almost nearly 10 months now, but government of Pakistan has not announced any policy yet for the refugees, but they are pouring in. And in our offices, we have almost conducted receptions of 200,000 people already. And we have a scheduled list till the end of May. We have already booked the schedule. We are scheduling people, about 500 people every day in our different offices across Pakistan. So I just want to know that what EU member states are doing, or are they doing any dialogues or with the government of Pakistan to announce any policy or to ensure spoke to the new arrivals who are like here. And most of the people are staying in hotels, and we are getting calls. And as a partner of UNHCR, most of the time we are not like, we have to be very tight-lipped just because of our agreements, and because they are doing quite a lot throughout the world, and most of the time. And in this scenario, after the regime change in Pakistan, we don't see that strong coordination of UNHCR with the government. And previous government was very open towards refugees, and the first time in last 40 years, refugees were allowed to open bank accounts in Pakistan. Harassment was marginally decreased just because of the previous Prime Minister Imran Khan had a humanitarian vision. And first time the most authentic document was also upgraded after a decade, where because most of the time they used to carry that pure card, and the expiry date was 2015 December. So during their travel, they used to face harassment, but this was done. And with the support of UNHCR and Saffron Ministry and Government of Pakistan, established 41 system, and all the process has been already done. So I would like to listen from you. Thank you.
Okay, so so not so much on UNHCR, but more respond directly to this question. So on the political dialogue, the policy dialogue between Pakistan and the EU, I don't necessarily have the details, but what I can tell you is a few things on the regional approach that the EU has taken. One is through the solution strategy for Afghan refugees, the regional refugee support platform that I already mentioned in my intervention, to which the EU was the chair the first year in 2021 and accepted to continue to be the chair. So through this mechanism, they are still, it's very much still active. There was a meeting of the core group in March. And this support platform is still active in coordinating and supporting the main country of asylum, Pakistan and Iran, but also looking at Central Asia, depending on how the situations evolve in the region. Second, there's a Team Europe initiative. I mentioned the Team Europe initiatives earlier. There is one that is proposed by the Commission on the Afghan displacement. So this is still being discussed with member states on which ones are going to contribute and how, and this is in process. As part of this, as a contribution to this Team Europe initiative, the Commission already did, through special measures, a package of 79 million to support the countries in the region. In terms of what the approach is, of course, humanitarian aid and DG ECHO is at the front on this, but there's also, in terms of the more development approach, we need to stay within the limits of the Council conclusion and the benchmark. So it's an approach that was called Humanitarian Plus, that's now called Basic Needs approach, to make sure that there can be support, but at the same time not legitimizing the de facto authority. So that's why it's a bit constrained on what can be done. And of course, the recent decision of the Afghan authorities in terms of the girls' education has been a step in the wrong direction from our point of view. Thank you.
I guess it's certainly also a matter of what nation states allow UNHCR to do, what they eventually can do in this respect. Looking at the time, I think we wrap up now. If you have further questions, you're of course free to approach people during the lunch break. We will move to one level down for lunch and get back at 1:30, I think, right? At 2:30. No? 1:30, yeah. So we'll get back in about 1 hour, and please enjoy lunch. Thanks all for your attention and for your questions. I hope this was a thoughtful panel, but I'm sure lots of things to talk about and to discuss over lunch. So thanks.